Welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here with us today because, honestly, we are about to embark on a truly profound journey. We're going to dive deep into what our source material calls the language of existence. We'll be unpacking this incredibly heavy and often completely unseen burden of the modern ego. And more importantly, we're going to explore this beautiful, liberating shift from claiming absolute ownership over our lives to a state of peaceful surrender. It's a fascinating look at how we perceive ourselves and the world around us, and I can't wait to uncover these insights with you.
I want you to just take a second and really let this quote sink in. Nothing in existence stands on its own, for its own sake. Nothing says, I am from myself. Our sources present this as the fundamental baseline premise of the entire universe. Think about it. The shade of a tree, the scent of a flower, the quiet patience of the soil. What we are seeing with our physical eyes are actually signs of a much deeper meaning. Literally, every single thing leans on a source beyond itself. And the text makes this incredibly powerful argument. The exact moment a human being forgets that source, they find themselves completely and utterly alone in the vastness of the universe.
Okay, let's dive right into this, because this brings us to the core existential question of our entire explainer. In whose name are you living? I know it sounds super simple at first, but it really demands that we stop and consider our true alignment in life. Are we operating purely under our own authority? Are we just relying on our own finite, limited strength? Or are we tethered to something much, much greater? I want you to just keep that question in the back of your mind as we move forward.
All right, part 1, the tragedy of Narcissus, the surface delusion.
Now, you're probably familiar with the myth of Narcissus, right? The stunningly handsome hunter who leans over a spring, sees his magnificent reflection on the still water, and just falls utterly in love with himself. But our sources highlight a really tragic flaw here. Narcissus completely failed to realize that the reflection was merely a play of light. He mistook it for an absolute reality. He basically claimed ownership over what was just a temporary reflecting capability of the water, and because he just couldn't tear himself away, he perished right there by the spring. The text argues that this isn't just some old, dusty fable. It is literally the disease of modern human beings. We are, quite frankly, drowning in the prison of our own reflections. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the massive distinction it makes between merely spectating and truly looking. Modern humans often don't actually look at themselves. We just spectate. And spectating is shallow, it's external, it's totally fragmented. It's what happens when we define ourselves entirely by temporary titles, roles, and false sparkles. Like our job titles, how many followers we have on social media, or our social status. Looking, on the other hand, looking is internal, it's whole. It's about recognizing the actual source of the light rather than just getting hypnotized by that shallow reflection on the water.
When we get stuck in that spectating mode, we end up taking on what the text calls the burden of I. We just assume total ownership over ourselves. We idolize our own reflection exactly like Narcissus did. But here's the catch. The more we define ourselves through these temporary false sparkles, the further and further we drift from the actual truth. And what happens when you claim that you are the absolute owner of your life, relying only on your own limited power? Well, the text points out that it seals all of our actions with transience. It places us at this incredibly lonely center point where our fear and our isolation just grow and grow. It's a heavy, heavy burden.
Which leads us to part 2, the threshold of awakening, shattering the mirror.
So, how do we escape this Narcissus-like prison? The authors present this absolutely exquisite metaphor of a noble horse crossing a stream. Picture this. The horse looks down and sees this dark shadow, a strange silhouette on the surface of the water. Initially, it's terrified. It startles at its own fake image. And for us, that startle is the threshold of awakening. It is that exact moment of shock when we suddenly realize, wait a minute, my contrived identities are just shallow illusions. But instead of just staring at the illusion until it dies, the noble horse does something incredibly brave. It steps forward, literally shattering the mirror of the water, and walks directly into the depth of truth.
And when we make that choice to step forward, when we dissolve our bond to that shallow reflection, a massive shift occurs. We realize we are not actually the absolute owners of our image. Truth basically cries out to us, you are more than this. You are carrying a sacred trust. We aren't owners, we are carriers.
Now on to part 3, a traveler in the desert finding connection.
To really drive this shift home, our source material completely changes the scenery. We move from the spring to a totally different landscape. Just imagine it with me for a second. The sun is absolutely blazing overhead. The horizon is just trembling with the heat. Endless waves of sand in every single direction. No trees, no shade anywhere. Just a traveler walking with a tiny water skin, breath growing weary, feet burning up. And as the mirages start mocking his sight, he's forced to ask himself, what am I actually relying on in this desert? My own strength? I mean, what can that really do out here? It's this desperate, terrifying realization that human muscle alone is failing.
So the crucial point is this: in the desert of life, relying on our own limited, finite strength, our muscle, is a losing game. It's only going to lead to our provisions running out, our water drying up, and our fear skyrocketing in total solitude. To actually survive, we have to let go of our reliance on ego and physical strength and instead forge a connection to an infinite source.
In the text, that ultimate life-saving connection is represented by the concept of Bismillah. Now, the sources describe this as way more than just a word or a simple beginning. It is a total, fundamental shift of alignment. When that exhausted traveler finally whispers Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim, in the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate, it acts as a profound declaration of relation. It literally lifts that crushing claim of ownership right off his shoulders. The text makes this beautiful observation: the blazing desert sun is still exactly the same, but suddenly it's no longer ownerless. And that creates this ultimate climate of security.
This brings up a really fascinating reframe of two words we usually run away from: helplessness and need. It's kind of surprising, actually. In our modern, hyper-independent world, we're constantly taught that helplessness is defeat and need is just a deficiency. But the source material flips that entirely on its head. In the climate of Bismillah, helplessness is actually a door swinging wide open to infinite power. And need is simply a hand reaching out toward infinite mercy. They aren't weaknesses at all. They are the exact, precise tools the traveler uses to connect to the divine.
And this brilliantly illustrates the complete contrast between the two central figures we've been talking about. On one side, we have Narcissus, trapped in the shallow end, claiming ownership, spectating his own ego, and ultimately perishing totally alone. And on the flip side, we have our desert traveler. He recognizes his own helplessness, invokes Bismillah, and goes into the depth. He is quite literally taken into the shade of a passing caravan. It just perfectly summarizes the difference between the disease of the ego and the ultimate cure of connection.
Let's move to part 4, the ego as a measure, not ownership.
Okay, so now that we've really explored these metaphors, let's get into the philosophical heart of this explainer. We need to redefine how we actually view our sense of self. The sources introduce this concept of enit, which translates to the ego, or I-ness. And honestly, prepare yourself, because here is the mind-bending part. The ego actually has no absolute existence of its own. No way, right? It's defined simply as a relative unit of measurement, just a hypothetical sense of ownership. It's granted to us strictly as a tool, like a key or a scale, so we can even begin to comprehend massive concepts like infinite power, knowledge, and justice. By understanding our own tiny little sphere of influence, we can start to grasp the sheer magnitude of the ultimate creator's influence.
To make this a bit more concrete, the authors use this brilliant analogy of a civil servant. Just think of someone working in a government office. If they use their limited authority to act in their own personal name, just for their own reputation and gain, no matter how great the work looks on the surface, it's tainted. They've wrongfully claimed authority for themselves. But if they act on behalf of the state, suddenly their work gains eternal value. They carry real dignity, order, and justice. We are that civil servant. The ego is our office, but the work we do absolutely must be done in the name of the ultimate authority.
And this leads us to one of the heaviest, most profound aphorisms in the entire text. The human is not the owner of the measure, but the one being measured. Let that echo for a second. When we mistakenly treat our ego, our personal scale, as our own private property rather than the sacred trust, we literally begin to be crushed under the weight of our own measurement.
This idea is directly tied to the concept of justice, and specifically the divine name Al-Adl, the just. The sources explain it like this: a physical scale is a visible symbol, but true justice itself is unseen. Human justice only becomes true justice when it operates under the shadow of a much greater justice. Because if we place ourselves at the center, our version of justice might actually just be revenge, or pride masquerading as righteousness. The unseen justice is constantly quietly measuring the heart of the person who is holding the scale.
When we finally start to see our ego and our lives not as our personal property, but as an entrusted guest, all those complicated knots just dissolve. This is what we call the shift of surrender. Ownership gives way to surrender. Pride gives way to servanthood.
The literal universe around us doesn't physically change one bit, but our gaze upon it completely transforms. We realize that our will, our mind, and our desires are really just envoys from truth. Everything, finally, is put right into its rightful place.
Let's move on and see how this builds into the very fabric of existence through language itself. The text uses the beautiful imagery of the Arabic letter Aleph. It stands perfectly upright and indivisible, representing oneness. But when you place just a single dot beneath that horizontal Aleph, it forms the letter B, the very start of Bismillah. The sources link this right back to the divine command to read. But we're not just talking about reading a book here. It's about reading the universe. Because when we read the letters of existence, not in our own name, but in the name of the Creator, the entire fragmented universe unites. Every single being becomes a deeply meaningful sign.
We've covered some incredibly deep terrain today, from the tragic shallows of Narcissus to the infinite, life-saving connection of the desert traveler. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Are you going to keep carrying the crushing, lonely burden of the eye? Will you just remain a spectating reflection on the shallow surface? Or will you have the courage of the noble horse, to startle, to shatter the mirror, and to carry your sacred trust into the deep, quiet security of surrender? The choice of how you read your universe is entirely up to you. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you next time.